There we go. Thank you all so much for attending this webinar, Flexible Billings 101, Understanding Flexible Billing, How to Get the Most Out of Flexible Billing. And I hope that you will get something out of this that you can take back and start using right away to make flexible billing better in your organization. And for those of you who do not know me, I'm Donna Hurst. I'm a principal and the COO of Synergy Business Solutions. I'm also a senior consultant. My contact information is here, and we'll have contact information presented again at the end of the presentation as well. So the agenda for our webinar today, we are going to cover billing information maintenance, billing rules, using Allocator, the billing transaction load and invoice creation process, invoice entry rate tables, invoice printing, posting and reversals, and invoice formatting. I'm going to let you know up front there are a couple of items that just due to the time constraints I wasn't able to include, so I'm already planning a Flexible Billing 201 class to cover those items. So we can stay tuned for that. So we're going to start with the billing process. And we're going to obviously be focusing on flexible billing today. But for those of you that might not be as familiar with the flexible billing process as others, our monthly process, of course, within Dynamics is we have financial transactions are created from all of our other modules, accounts payable, maybe some AR, purchasing, inventory, etc. Time cards get created and posted, and we create and post expense reports. So these all happen in their respective modules, and all of those items flow into our project module using the financial transaction transfer process. So that one's pretty simple. That just automatically happens. Then in your organization, Allocator may or may not do something with those transactions. So we've got Allocator there. And those transactions, or the results of those transactions, would flow into flexible billing, and using our billing workflow and process, we're going to generate some invoices, send all of our information over to the GL. We might do something with indirect rates if we're a government contractor, and then we close our project module. It's pretty simple. So we're going to obviously, this is the flexible billing class, so we're going to focus in this area, which is our billing workflow and process. This is what we're going to cover today. And of course, I'm sure that it's this simple in your organization. The transactions come into Project Controller, we create, we print, and we post. It's that simple. That's all we have to do in the process. Now, of course, it's actually not that simple. There is going to be some complexity here, of course. However, we are going to hopefully at the end of this make the process that easy for you. I think that you can do it. So I'm going to just jump right into billing information maintenance. And just so you know, I am not all about making you watch a slide presentation for the demo. I'm going to actually be jumping into the live software. I do, however, have the slide presentation available. And at the end of the session, I will actually put it in the GoToWebinar as a download, and you'll be able to copy that off. So I'm going to jump over to Dynamics SL, and we're going to talk about billing information maintenance. Now, there are two ways. So billing information maintenance is really the key setup for being able to use the flexible billing module. There are two ways that you can access billing information maintenance. One is through Project Controller, Project Maintenance. And I'm going to be picking on one particular project today, my RV0002 project. And when we have a project loaded, we have this billing information button that we're able to click right here, which I'm going to do. And this will bring up our billing information screen. So that's one way that we can access this screen. I'm going to minimize this. The other way is in the flexible billing module, we can go directly into billing information maintenance. And we can put in our project, and it's the exact same screen, exact same information. So 2 different ways. And so I'm going to start here, and we're going to cover the billing information maintenance screen. A lot of folks, you know, you might have inherited your Dynamics SL from somebody else, and so they just said, here's how you set it up. But there's some really great features and functionality that are available to you in billing information maintenance that you might not know about. So I want to go through and cover that. So first of all is the project bill with. This field allows you to combine more than one project together for billing purposes. You can still have unique allocation methods. You can have unique billing rules as far as, you know, how things are going to post. But if your customer says, yeah, I know that you're doing those 2 projects with us, but we'd like for you to combine them onto one bill, you can do that. So this acts almost like a parent-child relationship, and it's really as simple as you just type in your project, or you picked your project. I'm going to go ahead and pick this other Navy project. And when I do that, that's going to actually combine these 2 projects, all the transactions, onto one invoice for presentation to the customer. So it's a great feature. The project that's listed in this field is going to be the parent. This project 2 is the child, 14 is the parent. And so in this case, then, my project 2 bill with information, all of this is now not available to me to use. I see a last bill date and a billing rule, but that's it. The invoice format, number of copies, approvers, those are all going to be maintained on my RV14 project. So it is a really useful tool if you have that need. Only caveat is that the projects do have to have the same customer. You can't have 2 different customer projects and try to lump them together. And the 2 projects must have the same currency. So that is also, those are the 2 things in order to use project bill with. The next field is, this next section is invoice printing. And we're going to start with invoice formats. At the end, the last piece of the webinar today, I'm actually going to do a deep dive into the invoice formats. But with our invoice formats, you can assign a default to any project. So this field is an F3 lookup. You can see the different invoice formats that are available. You can have as many invoice formats as you want. It's almost unlimited. It's not actually an unlimited number of formats, but you can have as many as you want. And then this becomes the default. So if I have an invoice here, which it's not required, I will be able to utilize the automatic invoice creation process, and Dynamics SL is going to grab all my transactions, put them together, and use this format. I will be able to override that format and use a different one at the time of printing the invoice if I want, and I will show you an example of that. We also give you the ability to have attachments on an invoice, on the printing process. And where this comes in really handy is maybe my customer has requested, I'd like a top page summary, maybe just by task. I just want to see my totals by task for billing, but I'd like to see some detail behind that. I'd like to know who the people were, what their labor class was, how many hours they worked, the date that they worked, whatever information they want. You can include that as an attachment, and then when I go to print my invoice, it will print my top page summary, and then it would print my attachment right after it. So they're going to be printed together, kept together, and gives me the ability to provide all the information that my client may want without my having to keep anything offline. So remember that that is there, and we'll touch on the different attachment types and your formatting options when we go through the invoice formats a little bit later on. We also have the date print code. The date print code allows you to have the system automatically print on your invoice a formatted period of time or date item. So I'm going to F3 here, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. These are items in a code file, and the code file is DATP, and I'm going to show you that here in just one moment. But you can see I've got several different options, and I can say beginning period, this is start date through end date, last build date through end date or just worked through end date, I can choose any one of these options as a default on this project. So different projects can have different date print codes. The date print codes just need to be set up in that code file. For those of you not familiar with the code files, if I go over to Project Controller, we have Code File Maintenance. And if I do a DATP, here's where I set up what my different code files are and the descriptions. These are not populated by default within your dynamic system. So in your environment, if you were to go look at this, you might not have any, or you might only have one or two that you're using, but you can have a fair number. And I would suggest utilize the help file on this if you have a question about how to format those date print codes. If you do the Bill With tab, you can come right down to, here's my date print code, and it actually will display what the codes are and what the descriptions can look like. So the help files are really are great on that, although of course they'll also be in the handout as well. And I want to just show you real quick. I have a sample here. I'm going to flip back over to my PowerPoint. So my screenshot, I forgot to pick the one that I had there. But this is what it looks like, beginning period through ending period. These are already on the Crystal report formats, so you don't need to customize the report to have them display. If there is a date print code in the billing information maintenance, it's going to automatically print on your invoice. So another great feature, not a lot of people use that. Next, we have our number of copies. The number of copies lets you determine if you'd like to print more than one copy, but only during the final invoice process. This doesn't help with drafts. If you wanted to print 2 copies of a draft, you actually have to print them twice. But if during your final invoice printing process you wanted to print 2 copies, you can just change that to 2, again, for this project, and you will just get you'll get 2 copies printed during the final print. All right, then we're going to jump over to the next section here, which is our invoice processing. So all of these items have to do with our invoice processing. And we have this last bill date. And most folks think that this is really just informational because the system automatically will populate with the last time I ran an invoice for this project. And that is sort of true, except that now you know under your date print codes, if I'm using one of my last build date items, then it's going to pick that as the date to show as my last build date. So that is where, that's what that is. That's why it's there for you. Next, we have our billing rules. And billing rules are a very big deal in flexible billing. And we are definitely doing a deep dive into billing rules here right after this section. But just in a generic overview, what the billing rule does is the billing rule determines which transactions are going to load for invoicing. So based on our billing rule, it's going to take a look at the project transactions that we have sitting out there, and it's going to say, oh, these are the ones that we want to load into billing. It also determines how those transactions will post both to the project and to the GL when we run our posting process. And again, you can have you really could have an unlimited number of billing rules, although we suggest that you try to limit it to as few as possible, 1 if you can. That way, when you're doing your setup of your billing information, the person who's setting up your project doesn't have to necessarily take a lot of time to go, now what billing rules should I use on this particular project? So the fewer billing rules that you can get by with, the better, but you are not limited to just 1. Next, we talk about retention. Now, the retention method for the project and billing information, this is for the entire project. So this is not, at this level, we don't allow you to calculate retention on a specific task. From the billing information pane, it's the total project or nothing. We do have the capability to calculate retention on specific tasks, and that's covered in scheduled billings. So, but if I do want to calculate retention on a particular project, I would change that to total, and then I would put in what my percentage amount is. I'm going to save that because I do want to show that to you as we do our invoicing in a little bit. Now, the retention information, there are a couple of setup items associated with retention, and those are actually found in the Flexible Billings Setup screen. And I want to just show you this real quick. There is a Retention Options tab, and this is where you would specify the account category that's going to be used for retention, the GL account, and the GL subaccount. And you also get the option of whether or not you want to include tax when you're calculating retention. If you don't want retention to calculate on tax, you uncheck the box. If you do, you keep it checked. And we also have Include Other. And this is kind of a funny one because most people go, well, what other things am I going to have? If you're using the schedule billing options, you can include other line items like, say, freight is one of the options. And do you want to include those other items when you're calculating retention? And again, it's just a checkbox, yes or no. These items are global. So if I turn on Include Tax when calculating, that's going to be for all of my projects, not just the one that I'm looking at. So you do want to keep that in mind when you're making changes to your billing setup because it's an all or nothing. I'm going to go ahead and close that, and I'm going to save my change there. So that's the retention. Next, I did want to mention is that if you do turn on retention for a project, you will have the option at the time of invoicing that you can overwrite it, and you can turn it off at the time of invoicing. So if most of the time I'm going to calculate retention on this particular project, but then maybe I have one invoice and I don't want to do retention on that invoice for whatever reason, I can say no to it on that particular invoice. So you're not stuck with it the whole time. Okay, next I want to talk about billing cycles. Billing cycles and biller, so these two fields, not related at all, except that both of these fields are available to you if you need to do bulk processing. And so what do I mean by that? If you have, 100, 200, 300 invoices that you're processing, one, that can be pretty time consuming, and you might want to break that down into smaller chunks so that you can obviously have a fewer number to handle at one time, or maybe you have a need to group invoices together, maybe to give out to managers for review, something along those lines. If you just go to print your invoices, the system by default is going to just print them out in numeric, or it just prints them out like numeric order or alphabetic order, depending on how your project is set up. So if you need to create a list for Bob and a list for Mary, you have to then print, and then you have to sort through them and make your piles. So, and that can be a little cumbersome. Using billing cycles allows you to say this particular project invoice is going to go in this cycle, this other project is going to go in a different cycle, and when I go to generate my invoices, I can generate them together so that I'm keeping them all the same. So in order to better express this, I'm going to explain what we do here at Synergy. When we do our draft invoices, I want to create them and I want them to be distributed to the manager to do review and approval. So we actually created billing cycles related to who our people are. So we just give it a value, 1, 2, 3, 4, with a description. Again, this is a code file in code file maintenance, just like the dates, but it's the BCYC. And then I can associate this project to a particular individual. And then when I go to generate my invoices, I'm going to generate them by billing cycle, and I'm going to show you how that works. It doesn't have to be a person. You might have this project, we've agreed we're only going to bill every 2 weeks. These group of projects, we said we're going to bill monthly. So you could put them in separate billing cycles so that you're not actually generating invoices for projects that you don't want to generate invoices for. So billing cycles is a great feature. Highly recommend that you use that if you can utilize that or you have a need to. It's also good for reporting. You can say I need to see a list of projects for billing cycle X, and you'll be able to print reports and filter that way. So a great option. Billing types is actually going to be covered in more detail in the 201 class, but very quickly, if you have a need to take one invoice and split it to maybe multiple customers, the Navy only wants 50% of this project and they want you to send the other 50% to the Army, you can do that using the customer split bill option and filling out this new tab that pops up when you make a change here. If you need to bill specific tasks to a specific customer, you can do that as well. Or if you just need to get separate invoices out by task to the same customer, but your customer said, can you please group these in on one invoice and these go on another. So you have some options there as well. And again, in my 201 class, I'm going to cover that in a little bit greater detail. But just know that that functionality is there if you have a need for it. And at the end of our webinar today, if we have time and you'd like me to go into greater detail, I'd be happy to do that. The next tab or the next option here has to do with approval requirement. So if you in your organization you have a requirement to have your invoices printed in a draft or at least be approved or reviewed by someone before you're ready to print them in final, then you probably want to turn on approval required yes, and then fill in who the approver is going to be. If in your organization you just print you generate your invoices and maybe you print in draft and you just hand them out and then somebody brings them back and you're the same person that's going to do the actual printing, maybe you don't need to have the approval required turned on. You can go ahead and just flip that to no. When I generate my invoices, they'll be generated in an approved status so that I can just skip right over the approval process and go right to printing. So I can create and print. So just like that opening slide I showed you where we create and we print and we post. That quick little series only works if we're not approving. So, but if we do need to approve, we want the ability to drive who the approver is without necessarily populating, having to come in here and populate who my approver is going to be. And I can set up a default approver, again, back in my Flexible Billing Setup screen. And in the bottom of the first General Information tab, I have Invoice Approver Options. And so here's where I'm going to set who my default approver will be. It's either going to be, in this case, my project manager, who is and I think I still have my project here. It's this first field. Yours may be labeled differently. Yours might not say project manager, lead consultant. Yours might say project manager and manager 2 or whatever it may be. These are flexible descriptions. So I've got a project manager and a lead consultant, and I can pick who do I want to default as my approver, project manager, lead consultant, or do I have another person altogether in my organization that I want to be the approver, and I can get a full list of who all my people are and I can select who that's going to be. So if I do make that setting in setup, that's who it will default to for all new projects that are set up, new billing information going forward. It will not overwrite any of my existing billing information that I already have set up. So in this case, I still have Steve as my approver. I also have the ability to add a biller to my billing information screen. And this is who is responsible for creating the invoice. This field can also be used in bulk processing. So just like I did with my billing cycle, and I'll actually show you an example of that. I've got billing cycle and biller. And when I generate my drafts, if I am requiring approval, my approver is going to get either an email notification or a web app notification that they have invoices that need to be approved. They can go in, So say they go in through web apps, they look at it and they go, no, there's something wrong, and they reject that invoice. A notice would be sent if the biller is populated. The biller would then be notified that there is a rejection, because the biller is the person who is really responsible for making sure we get these things out the door. So the biller is not required, so you don't have to populate that. Approver is only required if we have approval required turned on. And just keep this in mind, standard default reports of the invoices out of Dynamics, they will actually print the name of the approver and the name of the biller on the invoice form. So if you do populate them, they're going to print. If you don't populate them, you're going to see approver, it'll be blank, biller, it'll be blank. So you'll definitely want to take a look at the invoice formats and then make any changes that you need to if you don't want those to print. And then at the bottom of this screen, we have this invoice entry rate table, which is also an often overlooked field when you're setting up your billing information. And what this field is used for is to associate a rate table, so just like our regular rate tables that we're setting up in Allocator, multi-level rate entry, associate a rate table with a particular project for use if we are manually entering an invoice. And I do have this set up as an example. I'm going to go ahead and save my changes. I've got project 5 where I have created an invoice entry rate table. I called it INVE, so it's the manual invoice table. And I'm going to jump over there real quick to give you a quick look at it because I'm going to show you an example of what this is going to look like during the demonstration. So what I did was I created a rate table and I specified that if the labor class of the person is PRJ2, I want the rate to just auto-populate at 210. So this is really handy if you have a need to manually create an invoice and there are rates associated with that based on something, if it's a labor class or an employee or maybe a project, and you don't want the person who's actually doing the data entry to have to remember what the rate is or have them go look it up. You can create a rate table that stores those rates, associate the rate table with the project, and then when they go to manually enter an invoice, it can find the rate for them. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get to invoicing here in just a moment. I'll go back to my project 2. And then the last item on our Bill With tab is our billing address. And this is used if your customer says, I need for you to send the invoice for this project to a different address. You can then populate the billing address here under address type. And when you print your invoice, it's going to look here first for the billing address. If this is blank, it's going to go look at the customer. So, but if you have that need, you have a very easy way to override the address for your customer without, having to go change customer information. Okay, I'm going to jump over to the Invoice Comments tab. And I did populate this here ahead of time so that you don't have to watch me type stuff. You have 3 boxes or places where you can actually put in comments related specifically to this project. So you have a project comment. This kind of prints at the top portion of the invoice, and I'll show you where that is as an example. You have the invoice header, and that also prints on the first page, top section, or you have invoice footer. And so this is the comments, and this will print at the bottom of the last page. So if your customer said, hey, I want you to include this piece of information on every project, please, or on every invoice, you can associate that wherever it's appropriate, and then this will automatically print on the invoice. Your format doesn't need to be customized in any way. These are built into the standard invoice formats for printing. Next, we have the additional information tab, and really during a demo this is pretty boring because it's kind of like this big blank screen. And what this can be used for is if you have a piece of information that you want to track related to this project, probably related to billing, there are about 20 fields that live on this screen that you can turn on you can give it a description, and then you can use this to enter in information. And then that, whatever you type in, is going to be stored with this project billing information and would be available to you for reporting purposes or potentially to even put on an invoice. One of the things that you do need to know, however, is that any of the user fields that you activate on additional information, they don't automatically appear on your invoice formats. The invoice format would need to be formatted using Crystal Reports to show the field and display it wherever you want. And real quickly, just in case you're not familiar with user fields, if you were to go into the Project Controller module, you have these ID fields. And the ID fields are all of the project user fields that are available to you to turn on or off at your whim. Everything related to the project billing starts with PB. So this is an F3. The descriptions hopefully kind of give you an idea that this is having to do with billing, because it's the billing master or billings master. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PB01. And you can see that this is visible, and the caption is PB01 character. And if we take a look at our billing information, it is visible, and that is the description. If I go to, say, PB02, it is not visible, but it is available to me. If it's not available, it's going to be flagged reserved, and then I can't use it. So I said there's approximately 20, but some of those are already in use by the system, and so we don't have them. So you don't really have 20. And unfortunately, when you do your F3, this doesn't tell you which ones are already in use, so you have to actually look at each of them. I'm going to go ahead and make this visible, and I'm going to say this is going to be item number 2. And you can tell it's a 30-character, so just a plain 30-character field that you can store information. Some of the fields are going to be floating or numeric. Some of them will be dates. So when I do that, and I've now turned that on, I'm going to actually reload my billing information screen so that you can see RV002. And if I go to my additional information, it's that easy to turn on a field, and now I have that 30-character field available, and I can store information as that in there as well. So very simple. And I think I'm going to go over to number 6, and you can see here 6 is one that's already in use. It's reserved, and it's not available for me to even try to turn that on. So the programmers are using this field for something. So not all 20 fields are available, but hopefully you can find enough for what you need. Okay, and this last tab is also a really fantastic feature for flexible billings, and this has to do with billing exceptions. And this actually tells us, so the following, whatever I put in here, will not be considered billable by the billing transaction load process. So if I have a project that I've set up, but the salesperson has come up with some crazy requirement, which they never do, but I'm just pretending, to say, okay, for this project, John Dynamics' time when he works as a junior consultant, his time isn't going to be considered billable. I don't want to have to go to John and say, hey, John, when you're filling out your time card, can you make sure that you don't flag that time as billable? That's be one option. Or I could go, oh, goodness, I have to create a new allocation method to make sure that I don't look for any of that time and exclude that. Or I can use my same setup, my same everything. I can come in for this one project, and I can say, okay, you know what? If the employee is, and if I do an F3, because I chose employee in the first list, it's going to PV for me, my employee list. I'm going to pick if the field is John Dynamics, and I can say, and the labor class is equal to junior consultant, that's going to be my exception. I can save that. So when I run the billing transaction load process, or if the system is doing it for me automatically, if this criteria is met, this time will not show up on an invoice. It's going to be excluded from the billing transaction load. I can have up to 3 filters per line. So I could say employee is John, the labor class is this, and then I have another, and it's a specific task, or it's a specific earnings type, or something along those lines. I've got a list I can choose from for an exclusion, and then you can see I can have as many exclusions as I want. So if I have several employees or several labor classes or several tasks, maybe this particular task isn't going to be billable, I can exclude them. So again, this would be really helpful if you have a specific project that needs something excluded. If you have like a task that you never want to bill, then of course you'd want to handle that through an allocation method and make it a non-billable item. But the billing exceptions is fantastic for those one-off items that sometimes, salespeople come up with. Okay, so that is everything on the billing information maintenance. And again, billing information maintenance is going to drive everything that we do as far as what's going to be loaded onto our invoice, what invoice format is going to default for us, how things are going to post. So this is really the heart behind the Flexible Billing Module. And so next I want to jump into billing rules. And I don't see any questions at the moment that I don't think I haven't answered, because I did have 2 and I think I answered both of them. So I'll just keep going, and I'm trying to keep an eye on that on my other screen, by the way, so if you do have questions or hands raised, I think I can see those. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump over into billing rules. And as I said, billing rules, very important part of the process. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump back into flexible billing, and I'm going to go into billing rules maintenance. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to pull up my simple rule that I've created for us. And this screen, I will tell you, when I first looked at it, I got very confused, and because I'm like, I don't understand. There's so much going on here, and there is a lot going on here, but it's pretty straightforward. You have to think about this screen it's one screen, but it has 2 very unique things that it's doing. It's broken into a top section and a bottom section. The top section are the rules for our billing transaction load. So when we have transactions that are created in accounts payable and Allocator grabs them and does something with them, or labor and Allocator does something with them, the account categories that are in this list are going to be the items that are going to be pulled over for billing. So if I have this billing rule in my billing information maintenance, and I code something that ends up in ODC revenue or subcontract revenue, when the billing transaction load process runs, it's going to see that line item, that transaction, and it's going to pull it over into flexible billing so that it can be displayed on an invoice. That's the whole purpose of this top section for the rules for billing transaction load. The bottom section is the rules for invoice posting. So up here we have, this is what's going to happen at the very beginning to create our invoice. This is what's going to happen at the very end, after we've printed in final and we want to post our invoice to general ledger and back to the project. And this just says, if my source account category was direct labor, how do I want this to post? What's going to be the T account? And yes, I'm going to break out some T accounts here for us during this webinar to help understand the billing rules. The billing rule posting process is very, very powerful, and so to make sure you have a really good understanding of what your options are is really going to be helpful. So I have a simple rule that I've created here, and I'm going to move this over here to the side, and that's not going to matter because I'm actually going to go into my PowerPoint, and I do have to do this in a PowerPoint because I need to bring up like 5 screens at a time, and it's a lot easier to do in a PowerPoint. So the billing transactions, I already mentioned that, these at the top section, which is what items are going to be loaded into billing. One thing, you can run the billing transaction load process as many times as you want. The system, when you do run the process, if it finds a transaction to load, it actually updates that line item and says, oh, hey, I've loaded this into billing already, so it's not going to pull anything in twice. So you don't have to worry about that happening. So then we get into our rules for invoice posting. And I'm going to start with just a simple example with direct labor. And I'm just going to start with this prime. And one thing that you do need to keep in mind when we're talking about invoice posting is that on our rules for posting, what you don't see is the AR account. That's not listed anywhere on our line. The AR account is implied as the debit posting for the amount of the invoice, and it's going to go look at your AR customer setup to grab that AR account. So you don't have to, when you're looking at this, you have to just go, okay, that part's already being taken care of. I only need to worry about what's happening on the credit side of the entry. And I'll reference that back a couple of times. So what happens if I have an invoice line item on a simple posting where I've got $1,300 that I have put on an invoice that's come over, it's direct labor? What's going to happen when I post this if this is my posting rule for direct labor? Well, what's going to happen is, oh, I need to go back one. Sorry, there was something in here I forgot to mention. This prime account that's listed here on our posting rule, the prime is the credit side of the entry. The debit's going to be AR. The credit is whatever account is in prime. So in this case, account 3000, and the sub account, which has the lowercase p's in it, that means go look at my project and tell me what the sub account, grab the sub account associated with the project, and that's going to be the sub account. So it's a wild card. So if I have a $1,300 invoice and I'm using this simple posting rule, I'm going to end up with a debit to my AR account for $1,360 and a credit to revenue, because that's what's in the prime. And whatever in the prime gets the credit for whatever in this amount. It actually is that simple. But of course, we have to make things a little more complicated because we have an adjustment account and we've got this little write down section. Not that we ever try to write anything down, but sometimes it does happen. So what happens if I've got my line item that comes over, it's for direct labor, but I don't want to bill all $1,300. I only want to bill $1,000 of it. I want to write off, in this case, the other $360. Our debit, of course, is going to be our AR account from the customer. That's going to be our $1,000. And my prime is going to be my $1,000 because the prime always gets whatever in the amount. But I've got this $360 that I'm going to have to deal with. So when I look at the next slide here, the credit is the prime plus any write-down amount. And I know this is a little strange, but we're going to T-account it and it works. So we're going to get a credit to the prime account for the $1,000. We're also going to get a credit to the prime account for whatever in my write-down amount. So I'm going to get a credit for $360. Then the adjustment amount is going to debit anything I have in my write-down account as well. So let's look at that as a T account. It'll make a little more sense, I think. So here's my $1,000, my debit to AR. I've got my credit to revenue. So that's my prime entry. Now I've got something sitting in my write-down amount. I'm going to get a credit to my prime account, and I'm going to get a debit to my billing write-off account, this $3,820. So if I were to run just an income statement with this information, I've got a $1,360 revenue entry, but I've got an offset of $360, so I really only have $1,000 of revenue. That's still a revenue account, and then I've got $1,000 in AR. So my T accounts, they still match. I've got $1,000 of revenue. Some folks do make the adjustment account the revenue account. So that way it would go in and out of both revenue. I'd have a debit and a credit in the same account. Some people like to have the write-offs go to a separate account so that they can see how much did I actually write off. So it just gives you some visibility into some information if you have your adjustment account be a different account number. So that is invoice posting using the simple method with a write-off. Now, I want to talk about secondary postings. And secondary postings are great if you're generating unbilled revenues. And when you post the invoice, you then need to create the revenue entry and relieve your unbilled entry. I know that sounds confusing, but this is a great feature, and I'm going to explain why here as we T-account it, and I love that because this is kind of, you're like, huh, what? But secondary postings are a great feature. So let's look at the same scenario, but we're going to use a secondary posting entry. So let's example, I have Allocator, and Allocator took my 10 labor units, and instead of just throwing that directly to direct labor, I said, you know what, I only invoice monthly, and I don't want to wait until the time that I print my invoices to know what's my revenue look like for the month. Am I on track? I want to generate an accrued revenue. It's not billed yet, but an accrued revenue and an unbilled accounts receivable entry so that I can, during, halfway through the month, I can see potentially where my revenue is sitting. We set up Allocator to create an entry to my general ledger and to my project to debit unbilled AR for account 1200 and credit my revenue account, revenues accrued for that same $1,360. And that's, again, not in my $3,000, it's in a revenue accrued account. So Allocator does this. Again, I can go, oh, I've generated $1,300 worth of revenue on that account that I need to bill. So on my invoice, I've got my invoice here and I've got my posting rule. On my posting rule, you'll notice my prime account is not my revenue account. My prime is my unbilled T&M. This is the credit. Debits on the AR side is always going to be AR. My prime account is going to be a credit. My adjustment account is going to remain the same in this particular case. And then I actually have, so these are the secondary posting lines, and I'm going to be posting and I'm going to go to the next slide because it tells me, actually, I'll go back over here. It's going to debit my revenues accrued line item and credit, so it's a debit and a credit, my revenues billed. So as I look at my T accounts, I love T accounts. Here's my $1,300 here's my $1,360 invoice line item with my posting rule. The first part of the posting rule is the same. So here's my Allocator entry. When I post my invoice, my prime is going to be my 1200 T&M. So here's a credit to my T&M account and a debit to my AR account. Okay, so this looks, that part's okay. I've got my my revenue or my AR entry, and it relieved my T&M, so that looks fine. But this does not look fine. I still have my Allocator entry sitting in revenues accrued, and I don't have any revenue because that's the secondary posting. And it does all happen at the same time, by the way. It's not like you have to do anything different. I just wanted to break it down to kind of show you. So the second part of the entry, which is the secondary posting, it's going to debit my revenues accrued account, and it's going to credit my revenues billed. So when I post my invoice, I get all 4 of those postings. And now my unbilled T&M is 0, my accrued revenues is 0, and I have an AR entry and I have my revenue entry. So all the T accounts work out there using the secondary posting. But again, the brilliance of this is that when Allocator is running throughout the month, before I invoice, I know what my revenue is going to be. Now again, I might have a write-off, so I can't say that I can't just throw that into revenue. I have to make sure that it's an accrued revenue, and then when I actually post my invoice, it'll relieve my accrued and move it into revenues billed. So hopefully that makes sense. And as you're scratching your head, of course, we always have to throw in that last little bit of craziness with the write-off. So my last item is going to be, we're going to do the same scenario, and this time with billing, or we're going to do a write-off. So my same 10 labor units, Allocator created my entry with unbilled and my revenue accrued, so that's great. I know what my revenue looks like. Then I go, oh, but I don't want to bill all of that. I want to write off the $360. I only want to bill the customer for the $1,000. So our adjustment account is going to come into play. So again, we're going to debit our AR account when we post for the $1,000 because that's the amount of the invoice. Then on the credit side, I get my $1,000, but it's going to and it goes to my prime account. And then I get my write-down amount, which also credits my prime. So there's my $360. And I get my debit to my write-off account. So if we stopped there, I've got AR, I've still got revenues accrued and a billing write-off, but I don't have any actual revenue yet. But my unbilled T&M looks good, so on my balance sheet, I'm golden. But I need to get that secondary posting to move this out of accrued and move it over into revenues billed. So that's the secondary posting that takes place. It's going to debit my revenues accrued account, and it's going to credit my revenues billed. So now my revenues accrued account is 0. My revenues billed has a value offset here by the $360, so I've got $1,000 of revenue and $1,000 sitting in AR. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, you'll get this in a PowerPoint so that you can refer back to this. And I know one of the questions that folks normally ask when we talk about this is, why did my secondary posting post the $1,300 and not the $1,000? Because again, we're posting an invoice, and the invoice was only for $1,000. So how did it know? Well, how it knows is on our posting rule, at the very end of our posting options, there's this little checkbox that says use bill amount. If we check that, then our secondary postings would use the amount that we billed, which was our $1,000. If we don't check the box, then it uses the original amount. And obviously in this case, we wanted it to use the original amount based on the way that our accounts are set up. Now, you can set up your accounts so that you do use the bill amount, but as you can see, that opens a big old can of worms, and I'm not going to go any deeper into that. I do actually have a separate handout that explains how you would need to set up your accounts in your posting rule in order to use the bill amounts, because sometimes some people want to do that. So if you're interested in that, I can certainly make that available. But that's as far as I'm going to go into it on this webinar. Okay, nobody had questions on that, so that's great. That made sense to everybody. So I'm going to talk briefly about using Allocator. I'm not going to do a deep dive into Allocator. I've actually considered doing a webinar or a deep dive, maybe a YouTube video on using Allocator. If that's something that you might be interested in, actually going into Allocator, doing a deep dive, if you wanted to send us that information, and then we could actually put that together if we know people are interested. So who uses Allocator and why? Allocator is great for generating revenue. It's also great for maybe generating a fringe cost if that's something that you need to do. Also, it's great for creating billing records for flexible billings to pull in. So we might be generating revenue, but we also want to generate some billing records. For those of you that don't use Allocator, you might be going, what is she talking about Alligator for? It's Allocator, not alligator, and I'll give you a brief, very brief overview. So big picture, Allocator this is what it is. It's a set of rules used to automatically have Dynamics SL do something when a transaction comes to a project. If maybe you buy some material direct to a project and you want to take that material, mark it up, and create a revenue entry. Allocator can do that for you. You don't have to manually do that with a journal entry or a project charge entry. Maybe on costs, you have your direct labor charges and you want to take that charge and apply a 25% fringe cost on top of that to your project. You can do that as well. Or as I mentioned, you can actually create billing records. So as I said, I'm not going to really go into Allocator in great detail, but I do want to show this. Using Allocator to create billing transactions does make your life so much easier. And so what do I mean by creating billing records? I'm using direct labor as an example. I can take these are the direct labor costs. So these are, people put time on their time cards. They put that 10 hours on a project, my project 2. I can take those units, I can multiply it by a rate that's coming from my rate table, and I can take the results of that might be my $1,360, and I can post that to a new transaction. I can create a new transaction called unbilled T&M or whatever you want to call it. And then in my billing rule here for my rules for billing transaction load, I can say, hey, go grab all my unbilled T&M and bring it in. And that's how the system knows to do that. So Allocator takes a transaction, does something with it, in this case creates a new transaction after multiplying my 10 units by whatever my rate is, creates this new transaction. That new transaction is then looked for by my billing rule. That's how it knows to bring in those items through my billing transaction load. Okay, so let's take a look at billing transaction load. And although that's not necessarily the complete end of the PowerPoint presentation for today, I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint and I'm going to move over into billing transaction load. So in Flexible Billing Module, we have an option called the Billing Transaction Load Module or screen. This screen might be set up in your environment to automatically run. As part of our billings setup screen, there is an option for transaction load where you can check a box to automatically load transactions as they're being generated by Allocator. If this is checked, then you might not be running the billing transaction load process because it's just automatically happening. However, I make a recommendation and I would highly suggest that part of your billing process be that you run this every month before you start billing, regardless of if it's being automatically loaded or not. I said you can run the billing transaction process as many times in a month as you want. It's not going to double up anything, but if you had an allocation batch that got hung up, that didn't post, somebody canceled something, there's any number of things that could happen. Potentially, since this runs at the very, very end, maybe something got missed. You don't want to miss a billing record. So come in, click the Begin Processing button, and let it find any records. If it doesn't find anything, it's going to say 0 records found, and you go, okay, great, everything worked, and you move on. But I would suggest that you do run the billing transaction load process. Now, so there are some options on the billing transaction load that you can isolate records to bring into the billing if you aren't loading with Allocator. One, you can specify, I only want to bring in records for a specific fiscal period. It will only find records for that period. You can specify a cutoff date. I'm only looking for records, billing records through a specific date. So if you do maybe billing twice a month and you only want to bring over records through the 15th, you can populate that with October 15th and begin processing, and it will only find records on or before that date. You could also pick a specific project. Maybe this project is getting ready to close, and the PM wants us to generate a final bill outside of my normal billing cycle. You can do that as well. Or GL sub-account, if maybe you have your projects, your sub-accounts are used maybe to kind of group projects together and you want to just bring over for a specific sub-account, you can do that also. If Allocator's helping load your billings, then everything is coming over. You can also just come into this screen, you can click Begin Processing, and this is what it looks like. It just says, oh, it found 20 project transactions moved to the unbilled detail table. So there they are, and there were 0 that were rejected. And this is really nice because even if it doesn't find any to bring over, if it finds a problem, it will actually tell you, there's a record sitting out there that I think I'm supposed to bring over, but I can't for some reason. And what might that reason be? I'm actually going to show you. I have an example of one. Here I created one that says one was rejected due to a billing exception. Some transactions were not loaded due to a currency mismatch. So there was a currency issue, and so when I ran the process, it said, I can't do it. So it actually gave me a nice message to explain to me why it couldn't load it over. So I wanted to show that to you. But of course, in our example today, everything loaded beautifully. So my billing's all loaded and I'm happy. So the next step now is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do invoice creation. So I'm going to talk about 3 different options for creating invoices. I'm going to talk about creating them, letting the system create them automatically using automatic invoice creation. I'm going to talk about creating it manually using manual invoice creation, and I'm also going to talk about manual invoice entry. There is actually a 4th, which is the scheduled invoice process over here, scheduled billings. That's going to be covered in the 201 class only for sake of time. So automatic invoice creation. I can come into the automatic invoice creation screen. I've got a lot of filter options so that I can create only the invoices that I want. This process is going to go out and it's going to look for all transactions that are not yet associated with an invoice. They're just sitting out there and unbilled, and it's going to create invoices for me. This is a great process. I can create 1 invoice. I could create 1,000 invoices with the push of a button, depending upon how I want to do it. Now, this is where I mentioned the billing cycles or biller ID. In this case, for Synergy, we actually automatically generate our invoices by a billing cycle, by our managers. That way, when I generate them, I get a list and it says, invoice number 1 through invoice number 10 was generated for billing cycle 1. That way I know all of the invoices for Donna are all grouped together. 11 through 487 belong to somebody else, but I don't have to worry about those. They're somebody else's. But they're all grouped together. So it's going to make printing my drafts and distributing them a lot easier. So that's using a biller ID or a billing cycle. And I'm going to go ahead and use the billing cycle here first as an example. I can also generate by sub-account if I want to do it that way. I can generate by a specific project if I want to do it that way. I have the ability to create with a start date and an end date. Now, the end date, you'll notice, is required. It's in red, so I do have to populate the end date. The start date is not required. If I populate the start date, then when I generate my invoice is going to generate and it's going to populate the start date field. This is not used for selecting specific, it's not used as a filter, it's really used as a view only, but just to help to pre-populate some data. I am going to go ahead and pull that in, and you'll be able to see that when I generate my invoice, I'm going to get invoices outside of 10/1 to 10/31. This is just going to be the start date on my invoice. I could limit it to a specific fiscal period if I want to put in a start and an end. The fiscal periods actually are used in the filter process. So in this case, I'm going to use, oh, and I also got company selection. If you're running multi-company, you can generate for just a specific company. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do it the first time with billing cycle 01, and I'm going to create an invoice. And now if I under billing cycle 1 had 50 invoices, it would have displayed for me, you got 50 drafts. It would have given them each in numeric order, so I'd be able to say, okay, for billing cycle 1, got invoice number 98 through whatever my ending invoice number or draft number is. So when I go to print my drafts, I can group them together as well, or they'll be grouped together because they were generated in that order. And I can go ahead and I can say, okay. So again, if it depends on how many you have set up that way. Okay. My next option I want to show you is the manual invoice creation. So I'm going to go ahead and go into, I'm going to minimize my billing role. I'm going to go into the invoice and adjustment entry screen, and I'm going to go ahead and pick on a project, and I have to try to remember which project I said I was going to do, and I think it was 3. Nope, I think it was 4. Got to remember now. I can pick my billing project. My customer automatically populates for me. Bunch of information over here. My end date is still required, so I'm going to put in 1031. You'll notice here, this is where my invoice and my attachments, they populate for me based on my billing setup, but I can choose a different format if I want. So this is where I can override the default, but it defaulted for me. It brings in my salesperson, it brings in my terms for my customer, and I can click this display button, and I picked the right project, which I did, yay. All of the transactions that meet this criteria, obviously not associated with another invoice, and that are on or before this date, those are going to populate onto my invoice. Now, when I manually create the invoice, as I just did, you'll notice that none of my line items are selected. I've got some buttons down here at the bottom of the screen that I can use to select all, and it'll select all of my invoices. So now, or all of my line items. So now I have an invoice for $195,000. I can clear selections if I want, and now my invoice is for 0. I can select a couple of items if I want, and I can say, you know what, these ones I want to write off. So if I have any items selected and I click the Write Off Selected button, it actually is going to change my amount to 0, and it's going to write off those values. Now, if that looks good, and then I say, okay, I want to write off those, but I want to bill the rest, I can select all now. The rest of them will be selected. These ones are still written off, and of course my net document amount has changed. So I've got these little buttons down here, hopefully to make my life a little easier. One thing I want to make sure I point out, because this inevitably comes up when I'm working with folks, is that let's say that I'm going to bill all these items, but I want to write off. I don't want to build these items. I'm not going to bill them. Unselecting them does not delete them. Unselecting them does not write them off. If I unselect them, I'm going to go ahead and save this invoice the way that it is for the 1937. I'm going to complete this invoice, and then let's just say I've approved it and I've moved on. The next time I go to RV004 and now I'm going to do my November transactions, when I display, those line items are going to keep coming back to haunt me because I didn't select them. That is telling the system, I just don't want to select them on this invoice. You're not telling the system that you want to write them off. So if you want to actually get rid of them so that they stop coming back, the only way that you can do that is to select them and to write them off. Which brings up one other point that I want to talk about in regards to invoicing, and that has to do with the document type. If you have an invoice, as I do here, where I've got some line items and it's going to be a 0 invoice, you probably don't necessarily need to print a 0 invoice, and you're certainly not going to send the 0 invoice to your customer. So we've given you the option here under doc type of where you can make a zero invoice an adjustment. So as I flag this as an adjustment, when I save, actually I'm going to change it to completed. A couple of things are going to happen. I'm going to get a message, and that message is going to say, saving an adjustment document with the completed status will queue it for posting. I don't have to approve it, and I don't have to print it. It's skipping those steps, and it's going to go straight to the available for posting. Do I want to continue with the update? Sure. It's now gone to printed status, and I can't do anything with those transactions. It's as good as done. The adjustment type of the doc type of adjustment is only good if we are using zero doc types. There is a question that was asked, does auto invoice creation keep the drafts as in process and not approved? So that, it depends. So if we have an approval process, if we're approving, and so I'm going to go over to my RV0002, and I'm going to pull up that draft that I created. You'll notice my status is completed. So because this particular project in my billing maintenance is set up as needing to be approved, they come in as completed. So it now has to go through approval process before it can be printed. If I don't have approvals turned on, so I said I'm not requiring approvals, when I automatically create my invoice, this would have come in as approved. So it would say approved, not printed or ready for posting. It would be approved, and then I would be able to just go straight to the printing process. But if I'm doing auto creation, they come in as completed if I'm using approval. Hopefully that answered the question. If not, I'm trying to watch the questions, so you can throw another question in there, and I will attempt to get to it. Okay, so this is my invoice that was automatically created by the system. My invoice on RV0004, I think, was my one, if I did that, if I remember correctly. Now that was a long time ago. Here's the one that I created manually by clicking the display button. And then I do have a third way. And that is my third option, which is manually creating an invoice, and that was using the rate table. And I want to show you that because I love this feature. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to do new, and I'm going to pick RV005. And I'm going to come down here, I'm going to populate a date because I do have to do that. It brings in my invoice format, brings in my information, and I'm just going to come right down here onto my line item, and I'm going to say I have 25 units that I need to bill, and I'm going to populate the rate type with my billing rates. Okay, now my rate is 0 at the moment. I'm going to make this full screen so we can see what happens. It comes in as 0. I'm just going to say I need this to go to my site work task. My count category, yeah, this was labor, so I'm going to go ahead and put in direct labor. And my employee was John Dynamics. Now watch what happens to my rate as soon as I click off that employee. It found that 210 rate because John Dynamics is a senior project manager. So again, if I'm just doing data entry and I'm told you need to bill 25 hours of time to this project for John, I don't have to go look up what the rate is. The system's going to keep track of those rates for me in that rate table. So this is how I can manually create an invoice using a rate table without going through the allocation process. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we do have posting rules around our account categories. So if you want to utilize the feature of manually creating your invoices here and using the rate tables, you got to think about what your account categories are going to be so that you make sure you get the proper posting. If I'm using my posting rule where I'm doing the secondary posting, my direct labor is going to go to, as we saw earlier, it's going to go to unbilled T&M. That's the way my rate table is set up. Well, this wasn't generated by Allocator, So therefore, I don't want it to go to my unbilled account. I want it to go directly to revenue. So you do have to make sure that you've got your posting rules set up properly to accommodate account categories if you're utilizing this feature. So you just want to keep that in mind. Okay, there is one other option. I'm going to go ahead and save this invoice, and I'm going to make that completed. That I did want to show you, and this I'm going to go ahead and select, actually, before I do that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and select all. One of the things that is available to you also, I'm going to save this, is this display order. This drop-down lets you change the way that your items are displayed on this screen. It does not have any effect on your actual invoice format or how things are going to print on your invoice. It's strictly related to the display order. If I were to change this to, say, the account category, or actually let me do task. So right now I've got task 2000 and then task 1000. If I change that to project task and I hit display, my task 2000 now is grouped down here at the very bottom, okay? Because that's the order I've selected it in. If I do it by labor class, labor class pops up to the top because that's the only one that has a labor class on it. So if you're looking, sometimes invoice line items, I've seen them where they're like 500-600 line items long. You can use the display order to change the order that they are displayed so that you can find things a little easier. But again, it's not gonna mess with your invoice format at all. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to complete that also. Okay, so those are the 3 different options for generating your invoices. And so what I'm going to show you here is there was another button down here at the bottom, and it's called View Invoice. Actually, I'm going to put this back in process real quick. So we can see we talked about Select All, Clear All, and Write Off. I do have the option here also to view the invoice. Now, viewing the invoice is going to bring it up on screen. It's not printing it to the printer. If I do have a PDF printer, it still bypasses. It just goes to view only. It's only showing me this one particular invoice. It's not doing all of them for all projects. And as you can see, I can kind of see what it looks like here. Oh, here's my senior project manager, John, 25 units. There's the rate. It populates. I've got some other groups and set John here. This is a 2-page invoice. I can look at some things and, oh, there's my biller, there's my approver, which I talked about. Those automatically show up on an invoice format. So I can see that information. Oh yeah, that looks pretty good, I'm happy, and I move on. So that's the View Invoice button. This last button here, which is there's also time card comments. If I have a line item that is originating from time card entry, and so I'm going to go ahead and complete that, and I'm going to go back to my RV0002 because I believe I do have some over there. There's my completed one. Let me go back to in process. Any of my line items that I think actually I don't have any that came from there. I thought I did. If I have a line item that originated from a time card and the employee put invoice comments on their time card, I would be able to see those comments under the time card comment button. So if you're not familiar with that feature, let me know, and I can go into that at the end of our program today. The last option is View Shipper. And the View Shipper is used, if you are not aware, the order management module can integrate into Flexible Billing. So instead of actually generating invoices out of the order management module, it will send the transactions over to Flexible Billing so that you can only create one invoice for a customer. If you have transactions that originate in order management, the View Shipper button would be available for you, and it can take you back to that shipper. That feature is also going to be covered in the 201 class, not in our 101 class. So I talked about that. Okay, so once I have all of my invoices completed, I'm I then have the option to print them. Okay, I'm going to save my changes, and oh, I did that for a reason. If you remember on my Project 02, I specified I wanted to calculate retention at 5%. And so when I make a change to the invoice and I save, you'll always get a message that says a retention amount has been calculated for this invoice. Do you want to add the item? I can say yes. Now I closed that, so I'm going to go back in really quick because I want to show you that that process actually added a retention line item under the Tax Retention and Deposits tab for retention and that bill amount of the 5% of my $44,000, and there's that AR retention account category that we saw in our setup. So it automatically calculated that for me. If I didn't want that to calculate, if I was back in process and I hit save, it'll say, do you want to add a line item? I can say no, and it was already there, so I have to actually get rid of it now. I save it. Do you want to add this line item? I say no. It doesn't generate the retention for me. So that's how, if I needed to not calculate retention on one specific project or one specific invoice for a project that I normally do, you can overwrite that feature. All right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to complete. I'm going to save, and I'm going to say no, don't add that line item, and we're good. Okay, so next we move then into invoice printing. So under the invoice printing screen, and I'm getting there, this screen is used to print all of our invoice types except for construction invoices. And the construction invoice, again, that'll be covered in our 201 class if anybody needs that. But all other invoices out of flexible billing are printed from the invoice print screen. And we can print our drafts, or we can print final, or we can reprint old invoices all from this one screen. We have some filters so that we can print for, again, a specific company, a specific sub-account. I can also print by specific biller. So if I'm using I showed you using billing cycles, but if I set up my billers to be maybe, if I want to try to just generate by biller, I can do that as well. So at Synergy, we use the billing cycle, and so when I print, it prints all of them, but it does group them together. Or I could have set up my approvers basically as who the biller is, and then I'd be able to print just that group. Again, preliminaries for my drafts. And then I've got my draft ranges, so I can limit if I only want to see one, or if I just want to see a group, I can do that as well. And then we have the invoice date. Invoice date's super important, and you do want to make sure that you populate your invoice date before you actually print your finals. This is the invoice date that's going to go to accounts receivable, and that's going to drive due dates based on terms. So you want to make sure that you're getting your invoice dates correct. Also, I've always found this a little bit strange, but it is what it is. The invoice printing, to me, that's a report. I'm trying to print an invoice. I would find that under reports, but you don't. It is considered a process, so it's found under invoice processing. Okay, so a couple of things about printing your invoices. You can print your preliminaries. You can print them to a printer, or you can print preview them. I'm going to go ahead and just grab my one for the RV002. So if I'm doing preliminaries or my drafts, I can go ahead and print preview. And I'm going to go ahead and I will click the print button. Now, when I'm print previewing, of course, they're going to come up one at a time on my screen, and I can look at them. If I print to a printer, that's great. It's going to print one right after the other out to my printer, so that's a good solution. And we'll take a quick peek here. I wanted to show you I did have that date code on this particular billing information maintenance. So I've got my period beginning 10/1 through 1031. And I've got my invoice header comments and my project comments. And then at the bottom of page 2, I've got the footer comments. So you can kind of see where those print by default. And then again, I've got my approver and my biller. So I can review, see what those look like, and then move on. And if I was printing more than one, as soon as I closed that one, the second one would print. I do need to point out here that if you are printing to a PDF printer, we like to actually print to PDF and print them by group so that I can then email them to the manager for review. One of the things that and you may have already run into this, if you are printing to PDF, if you're just printing to standard PDF, it prints one, and then when it goes to print the second one, it overwrites the one that was there. It doesn't append, it doesn't create one big file. Each invoice is a unique document. It's like a unique report, and it doesn't try to change the name. So printing to a PDF can be a tad problematic. So I have a couple options I was just going to just let you guys know about. One is there is a free product that you can download. It's called Bullzip, B-U-L-L-Z-I-P, and I'm going to show you an example of it here in a second. It's a Bullzip PDF printer. There's a free version and a paid-for version. I use the free version, and there's a little bit of setup on that, but it lets you create a file and append to it. So I can create one PDF with a whole bunch of documents in it, invoices, if I print to PDF printer instead of the standard one, and that's freeware that's available. The second option is there is a third-party add-on product to Dynamics called Liaison Messenger, and that product actually lets you create a draft or create your invoices, whether it's a draft or a final, and it can print to a PDF, and it can also email immediately to the manager for approval if that's what you're trying to do. It's a great little tool. I don't know if I recorded, we did a demo of it, I don't know if I recorded it or not, but if you're interested in that, you can let your client service person know, and we'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. So the Bullzip one is free, that's freeware. The Liaison Messenger is not free, but some really great functionality there. One thing to note, you can print preliminary invoices as often as you want, or as many times as you want. If I, send that out and they send it back for a revision and I make a change, I can keep printing it, 1,000 times if I want. Let's see. Okay. So the only difference between printing an item in preliminary or in draft mode and in final is really going to be the number of the document. Drafts only have a draft number. They don't have an invoice number. It's really the only difference. And drafts, you can, or in preliminary, you're only going to see items that are completed or in process. You're never going to see items that are approved. Okay, and so that segues very nicely into my review and approval process. So I'm going to jump over to the invoice review and approval. If you have approvals turned on, then you will need to run the approval process, whether your manager is approving it through web apps, which they can do, or if you're doing hard copies and sending those around and it comes back to you, and then you just come in here and you make your approvals. So I have 3 documents for this approver that are in completed mode. I'm just going to flag them as approved. As soon as I save, they disappear from this screen because now they are approved. And when I go back into my invoice printing and I go to preliminary, actually I can still see my approved ones, but you'll see that they're approved. I could still print them in draft if I want, or I can go right to final, and in final I'm only going to see the items that have a status of approved. And I'm going to go ahead and pick on my 02 through 02, or just that one project. I'm going to make sure I change my invoice date to be the 31st. And you'll notice I only get the option here to print to a printer. I don't get the ability to print, preview it, although I could print to a PDF printer if I wanted to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print my invoice. I'm going to print that, and you're going to see I am printing to a Bullzip printer, so it'll pop up here quickly. I know I do get questions about this invoice printing process because I'm sure that you've noticed, even though I've done a really good job talking through it, it's not super speedy. The invoice format associated with the Crystal report that's associated with the invoices, it's pretty big, and so therefore it does take a little bit of time to print. This is the bullzip printer. Again, I can append it if output exists, and I can default that as a selection so that I could create one big file if I have multiples that I'm trying to print. Otherwise, I can change where it's going to print to, and I can just hit save. So that's the free version of bullzip. And it's gone ahead, it created my invoice, and it printed it, and now instead of a draft number, I have an invoice number at the top. And again, that's really the biggest difference between printing in preliminary or draft mode and printing in final, is that guy right there. Okay. If I was printing, and I don't have an example of this, but I did want to let you know, if I'm trying to print a draft, it would happen in draft or final mode, and there's an account category that is on my invoice, but that's not on my invoice format. It's in the invoice and adjustment screen, but it's not on my invoice format. The invoice actually, when it would give me an error message in here, and it would tell me that I'm missing an account category. So you definitely want to pay attention to the error messages box to make sure that there's never anything there. Okay, next I'm going to jump right over into postings and reversals, because once you've printed your invoice, there really isn't anything else you can do with it. You have to go into the invoice and adjustment posting. I would highly recommend that posting you do immediately after you print. Don't wait, and there's some good reasons. We're going to talk about that briefly. The invoice and adjustment screen, when you open this up, again, just like all of the other screens we've talked about, we do have some selection or some filter criteria. I can filter on sub-account. I can filter by biller. I can post only that specific billers. I can use the cutoff date to only print or only post invoices through a specific invoice cutoff date. And then I have my posting period. Interestingly enough, there is no posting period on my invoice at this point. The posting period gets assigned through this screen. So if I had some invoices out there that I printed September 30th, but I forgot to post them, when I come in here and I say I'm going to cut off everything through November or October 31st, posting period is 10. It's going to find those September invoices and it's going to post them to period 10. That's why you always want to make sure as soon as you finish printing that you come in here and you post immediately. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to post, and it's only found one invoice. It should only find one invoice, and it's going through my posting rule right now and doing everything that it's supposed. Oh, I actually had a second one that was already in there that was available. So see, I didn't know that I had two. I was only expecting one. It's going to give me a register, so I'm going to be able to go, what did I print? Oh, I had that 0 invoice. That's right, I did. So I did have actually a second invoice that actually posted, and that was that 0 invoice that I created on my project 4 for the U.S. Coast Guard. And then here's the posting results for, and it's a little fuzzy here, but my posting results for my project 5. So that report's going to print, it's completed, and I have 2 invoices, and that's the batch number that they updated in. Again, if my posting rule does not have an account category that was on my invoice format, I'll get an error message in here also that would tell me one invoice didn't post because it was missing account category. And it actually tells you the account category. So always keep an eye on your messages when you are doing posting. I'm going to do a quick reversal so that I can show you the fiscal periods for reversal process. So if we've posted an invoice and then we realize, oh, darn it, I made a mistake and I want to fix it before I send it out, I can go into the invoice reversal and duplication screen. I can pick a particular project and I can pick a particular invoice. So I'm going to pick that invoice 91, which is that one that I just had here. It tells me what the draft number was. all of this information is just so that I can make sure I'm picking the right invoice. And then I've got some reversing document and new document information. One thing I do like to point out, I have the option here to reverse the document, and if I reverse it, if you've ever worked in the Accounts Payable module, if I void a check, it reverses out the check, and it also reinstates the original voucher because that voucher created some expense for me and I need to make sure I do something with it. The reversal process does the same thing. It's going to reverse my invoice, it's going to back out that invoice, but it's going to reinstate all of my line items. So it's going to create an exact duplicate of the invoice at the same time so that I can go in there and do something with that because those transactions now need to have something done with it. That's the reverse process. Reverse is going to reverse and duplicate. The duplicate button is just going to duplicate. It's not going to reverse. So if I said, wow, that invoice I created in October, I really like that one, I want to do it again, I can create a duplicate of it. I don't actually have a lot of customers that use that, but it is a feature that's there. So I can see that my original document posted to October, and my reversing document is going to post at this point also to October because I'm still in the same period. Although if I had already closed and was in November, this would actually populate with November. It's going to populate with whatever my current posting period is. So you need to pay attention to that. My original was in 1 month. My reversing is going to go into another. So anything that I do on the new document, it's going to affect whatever period is here. So I'm going to go ahead and reverse, and magic, it's that quick. It created a reversing document number 80102, and it gave it an invoice number. When I do a reversal, it says, all right, we're reversing it. It's reversing and creating and basically bypassing any approval or print process, and it's now ready to be posted. And the posting period for this document is period 10. Then it also created a new document for me, which is document 103. So I'm going to go ahead and jump over back into my invoice and adjustment maintenance screen, and I'm going to pull up that project, and we can see I have invoice 102. It says it's printed. It's already gone to the point where it's ready to be posted, and I have 103, which is in process, and it has all of my line items back. And at this point, I can decide what it is I want to do, what I want to change, whatever was wrong, I make that change. I have to complete it. I have to go through the, oh yeah, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to add a retention. I have to go through the approval process and print and then post. So on the invoice and adjustment posting, I now have this option. Well, I had this option here before, I just didn't talk about it, fiscal period for reversals. So my reversing document was created for period 10. I saw that. So I know that I have a reversal that I need to post for period 10. So one of the things that I want you to keep in mind, because this bites people sometimes, is that, okay, that got created for period 10. That's great. My posting period is now disabled. I can't change it. This is going to post my reversals only at this point. So I go ahead, I process, it's only picking up document number 92, that's my reversing document. You'll notice Allocator is trying to run, which it will always do. It may or may not find something. There is the option where some folks, they want something to happen to transactions after the invoice posting process takes place, and so that's why that's there. Again, it gave me my report, and I go ahead and I say OK. Okay, so that takes care of invoice reversals. Talked about those, and okay, so next I'm going to jump into invoice formatting. My invoice formatting, I think it's about 10 minutes. I do want to be sensitive to people's times. I know that this was billed as a 2-hour class, and believe me, I'm going to use it. If for any reason, if you need to jump out, please feel free to do so. Again, I do have the PowerPoint that I'm going to upload to you so that you can have all this information, but I've got probably about another 10 minutes for this last section, and then I'm going to turn you all on so we can have some Q&A time if we have any. So invoice formatting, I'm actually going to bring over my PowerPoint for this because there's some great slides in here I want to show you. And the couple of items regarding invoice formatting. First of all, help files. Use the help files. F1 on the invoice formats, very helpful. There's very valuable information in there. Also, a number of format changes, as we've shown you today, are done through the desktop application. Who the biller is, who the approver is, the printing on the bottom, how you can print notes, the date formats. Those are all things that are done through the desktop application that do not require changes to the actual form itself. Some changes might require Crystal reports. If you want to put change the logo on your form, things like that, or change the font. Those are all done using Crystal reports. That is the tool that all of the invoices are built in. And so you need to have some Crystal report knowledge. Of course, we're always here for you, and we're happy to help you. Also, you do have user manuals, and so there is a flexible billing user manual, and there's great information in there, and I'm actually going to show you some of that. So this is an example of invoice sections. This is right out of the flexible billing user guide, not the help file, but the user guide. This actually shows you when we're talking about headers and footers, what those are, and by default, what information will print. There's this top section, here's where the logo would go, here's where the customer address prints by default, the work through or those user-defined dates, the comments, footer information, biller, approver. This is straight right out of the book, and this is what the default form looks like. So that's available. The second thing that's also available in the user guides is when you're thinking about your invoicing, you might have one invoice format, but you might go, I have one invoice format, but I'd really like 5 because I've got different customers and they want some different things. In the user guide, there are samples of the invoice format ID, so that's the layout, the BIONO, and there are section types. I'm going to show you those, and depending upon the section type that you choose when you set up your invoice, you're going to get different information. If you choose section type LO1, you'll get labor class, hours, rates, and amounts. If you choose section type LO2 for, say, direct, for labor, you're going to get the labor class, but you're going to see it broken down by employee because it's labor class employee. So we say the employee, the hours, the rate. So even though our values at the end are the same, based on the section type that you choose, you can dramatically change the look of your invoice. And all of these section formats, there are visual pictures in the user guide that show you what each of these section types will result in. And then there's also headings, column headings, and I'm going to point those out here because I'm going to refer back to them in just a moment so you can know that those headings are there. So one thing about invoice formats, you can create a new invoice format and play with it. Go in, take one of your projects, even in your live environment. If you're not doing things with Crystal, if you're just doing it through the user interface, create a new invoice format. Don't mess with your existing ones. Create a new one. Play around with the different formatting, the different section types, different headers, etc., and print preview. Again, it's just a report at that point. As long as you're not printing and mailing it to somebody, you're fine. And invoice formats never mess with your data. So you can change your invoice format and reprint it a bazillion times if you want. So have fun with that. On the invoice format maintenance screen, which I'm going to take you in there and show you, this option is also in the user guide, which is helpful. When you're looking at your section types and you go, wow, I really like that, amount by account category, employee, and comment. I really want to use that section type because that's really what my customer would love to see. You have to know that that section type is only available on these formats, BIONO, 020, 030, 040. I'm sorry, it's only available on 010. It's not available on 2, 3, or 4. It's on 1, 90, and 5. So again, using the user guide, very helpful because you're going to then know which formats you can use with which section types. And I'm going to jump over into the application here in a second and go through. I think that was my last. Yep, that's my last slide. Okay, so I'm going to jump back here and I'm going to go back into the live software and I'm going to go into Invoice Format Maintenance. So in the Invoice Format Maintenance, you can define what your format IDs are. So again, you don't have to make them TM01, TM02. We just did. I should put a typo in there. My I should not be capitalized. You put in your invoice format and then you give it a description. And if you're going to have, say, multiple time and material invoices, maybe one that's a summary and one that's a detail, you probably want to build that into the description. So when you go to choose an invoice format as default on your billing information, you can tell by the description which one you're choosing. So invoice format and description, user definable, and here's where you pick up what your report ID is going to be. So I showed you that little thing that had BI010, 020, 030, 040. So you're like, okay, well, what exactly do those mean? Well, one is only certain section types are available based on the report ID that you choose, okay? And your report IDs they're in the book, so you get in your user guide so you can see them. But when you F3, what you'll get is these are all of the different report IDs that are available, and you're able to see that you've got 10, 11, 12. It's basically BI01X. These are all basically the same invoice format. They're work performance detail invoices. There's just 9 of them that are available to you. Maybe you want to use BI010 and you're going to use certain section types on that and all that's fine. And you can create a second invoice format and use BI010 again and do some other things with it, maybe summarize a little bit more or whatever you want to do. But let's say that you need to go into Crystal Reports and make some changes, maybe with a logo, maybe with something that one of your customers wants that's very specific that we can't control through section types, etc., then you might consider using the second report because you're going to go into Crystal and you're going to modify BI011, but we don't want to modify BI010. So again, if you can make modifications through this user interface, just use the same one. But if you do have to start going into Crystal, each time you go into Crystal and you start making changes, you want to use a different invoice format because in Crystal, you're affecting all of the invoices associated with that report ID. So hopefully that makes sense. And so we've got work performance detail invoices. We also have project to date work performance. So you can actually get project to date information if you're using the BI02X option. The BI03X, this has project to date prior work performance detail invoice. So there's some different options there. The BI04 series, project to date work performance detail with budget. So if you want to be able to print your project budget on the invoice and show your customer how you're doing budget to actual, use a 4X option. The 5X are our government contracting items. And then the BO9X series, these are for attachments, so that you'd want to use those for your attachment and give them the greatest level of detail. And again, you can refer, I'm just going to move this guy over here really quick. You know that BI010 and BI090, they all have the same options as far as the sectioning. It just depends. You can make one a summary and one a detail. So I'm going to go ahead and pick on BI010 because that's the guy I've got already in here. So when I've given it a description, I've picked what format I want. So next I move into totaling. And so there are some totaling options that are available. By default, totals by section, and those are the first column here, which is the section. This is user definable, so you determine how I want to group account categories together. So if my section 4000, that's where all my labor items go. I can use section 4000 for direct labor, section 4000 still labor revenue, my account categories. I can have them print different section types. So this first line, if it's direct labor, I'm using LO2, which is labor by class. So I'm looking at the labor class and the employee. But this labor item, which is labor revenue account category, it's using AO1, meaning amount by account category. So I don't have to keep everything the same. So you have a lot of flexibility here based on the account category, how you want to display your data. And I do want to caution, you almost never will want to see your one account category listed twice on an invoice format. If I put direct labor on here twice for whatever reason, I'm going to get all of the information twice. My invoice is going to be for a lot more when it prints than it's supposed to be, and it's not going to match what my screen said because of the way that I'm displaying data. So you want to take great care that you're not doubling up account categories. And I did say almost always, because there's one exception, which I'll talk about. So if I'm doing section totals, then based on how I group my account categories by section, I will get a subtotal. I can also group by project and task. And project task totals and project totals are great if I'm running multiple projects. How I mentioned at the very beginning how I can bill more than one project together. If I can do project and task or project totals to get those separated out. So again, you can play with those and see what they look like, have fun. Just create yourself a new format, copy one of your existing ones, call it something else, and then put it on one of your projects and see what it looks like. And I'll finish up here real quick. Down here in the bottom, I kind of talked about your section numbers. That's just the way we were going to group things. Your invoices will print in this order. So it does group by section, and it's going to print in this order. Section types, I've talked about those. The descriptions are here in when you do an F3. They're also in your book or in the user guide, so take a look at those. Account categories, these are all the account categories that if it's on your invoice and adjustment screen, you want to make sure that they're in here as well. And then we've got the invoice account category description. If you are printing account categories descriptions on your invoice, you might not want to have the default one print. If you want to change it up a little bit, like you might not want to call labor revenue, you might want to call it labor. You probably don't want to show that to a customer. Maybe I want this to also say labor other. So when those line items print, they're under a category called labor other. You also have section descriptions, and of course the section descriptions are related to these sections. And so you can assign or type in a section description. So in this case, I would probably want to, normally if you have the same section number, you want to try to keep your section descriptions the same across. Although if you don't, if I did have this say labor other, if I printed an invoice and it had both direct labor and labor other, it's going to print direct labor. It's going to use the top one. If I don't have direct labor and I only have labor other, then it would use labor other as my section description. So if it's both, if there's both on the invoice, it's going to just use the top one. If I don't have the top one, I only have the second one, it'll use that. So those are our section descriptions, and here's where you can specify, yeah, print the section descriptions or don't. You can also specify whether or not you want a subtotal to print at the end of each section. So again, we've got section totals. You can also do section subtotals. And then I pointed out the column titles earlier on, hours, rate, amount. If you want those to print, you can put a yes in here. If you don't want them to print, you can just change it to no. And then I mentioned you almost always never want to see the same account category listed twice. The only exception is if you have a section that you're having a recap section. So when I talked about how you can have an attachment, you can have like say a summary, a top page summary, and then a detail. But if you want to just have like say a detail invoice, and at the bottom of the invoice you just want to group, you want to do a quick recap by task, something along those lines, you can do that by adding a line item. I'll come down here, I'll say it's going to be like 9,000, and I want this section to just be amount by, I'll just say amount by account category, task not available to me there. I can pick my account category, like say direct labor, not direct or direct labor, and then I can specify that this is going into my recap. So I'll get, at the end of my invoice, I'll get a little recap section. So recapped items that are marked as a yes do not add to your total, so it won't mess up your invoice. So this is the only time that you would ever want to see an account category on an invoice twice. Okay, and I think that takes care of it. So that's our wrap up, and I know I'm running really close to the amount of time. I am happy to stay on the call and answer questions if you have any, or if you're not exhausted and blurry-eyed from a very quick 2 hours of stuff. This is everything that we did cover. And of course, customer source is always a reference for you. And if you have any questions now, I'm happy to take them, or you can always call me or email me. And I'm not super great with using the GoToWebinar, so I will, let's see, I want to